in this unit, up to this point, we've talked about just microscopes. And so we had to introduce microscopes and learn how to use microscopes before we could really start to study cells. So that's where we're moving on. So we're going to be looking at cells next week. We'll look at all of these types of cells. These are all common things. And you can see different types of cells, different shapes and colors and so forth. But we're going to talk about them. So to begin, what is a cell? Like, what can our definition be? Grace? Well, not. Sometimes it is, but not always. Like, is one of my cheek cells a living organism? No. It's part of a living organism. So what we say is cells are the basic unit of life. All living things are made of cells. We won't get into a lot of details about the history of this, but cells were first really began to be studied in the 1600s. What was necessary before scientists could really start to study cells? Harder? Microscopes. Right, microscopes. And what was the important feature of a microscope that wasn't really available until that time, Brian?
Like a really magnified lens.
Yeah, lenses. A lens is basically just a piece of glass that bends light in a predictable way that you can use to manipulate an image. And lenses can magnify an image, as we know. So once people started understanding how lenses work and be able to create lenses, they were then able to make microscopes and increase the magnification to see things. One of the first scientists to see cells was a scientist named Robert Hooke. And he was really who's credited as the first person to see cells. What he looked at was this. What is that? Pass that around, Alex. What is that I just gave you? Yeah, it's cork. Okay. Cork is from a plant. It's from the bark of a tree. And so, because it's the leftover from living cells, when Robert Hooke looked at cork, he made very thin slices of that cork, looked at them under his microscope. These are the drawings that he made. And what he noticed is that the cork is made of a series of these small little sort of boxes, kind of all arranged together. And he called them cells. He called them cells because they reminded him of the rooms that monks slept in monasteries, these simple little square rooms. And so that's what he called them. But those were not living cells. What I'm passing around is not alive. It's actually just the remaining cell wall of some plant cells. But they were cells nonetheless. First person to see living cells was Anton van Leeuwenhoek. And Leeuwenhoek looked at a variety of different things in his microscopes. He was able to create really powerful microscopes for the time. And in 1675, he observed pond water and noticed that in the pond water there were living organisms that were too small to see with unaided vision, but he could see them using the microscope. He looked at samples of blood and saw that there were components in the blood, cells. It wasn't just sort of a red liquid. He looked and saw moving sperm cells. And Leeuwenhoek actually, he had a unique method for creating lenses, and he didn't share it with anybody. He kept it hidden. So nobody was really sure how to make lenses like Leeuwenhoek did. And so he was able to create these really detailed images. And his microscopes didn't look like sort of a typical microscope that you would imagine. Now, if you went on to Google a couple weeks ago,
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
yeah, you may have seen that.
Yeah.
You didn't know it at the time, but that was Leeuwenhoek. This is him, and he's holding one of his microscopes. And what his microscopes look were nothing like we would think of a microscope. This was it. And what he did is he created these very powerful lenses, spherical sort of lenses, that he mounted in this metal plate. And he would put his sample that he was studying on this little pin, and then look at it from the opposite side. Could adjust the focus and move it with these screws here, but he was able to get very good magnification with this simple microscope. And so over a period of time, scientists studied cells more and more closely, started to learn about where you would find cells, what parts are actually within cells, and sort of this knowledge that they gained over time is sort of put into this thing we call the cell theory, which describes the basics of cells. And it has three parts that you should know. Cell theory, sort of common sense. First, it says all life is made of one or more cells. So all living things are made of one or more cells. Also, cells are the smallest form of life. Some organisms are made of a single tiny cell. And then the last part of cell theory is about where cells come from. And because we studied spontaneous generation, you know the answer to that is, where do cells come from? From life, from other cells. Cells are able to reproduce. So we are going to spend most of our time studying what we call cell organelles. Can you guess what is an organ? For example, in a living animal. Francesca?
Like part of your intestines, or just things that make up your body that help
The
us
parts, yeah, that within our body, that each one has a different job to do. You know, your heart is an organ, has a job to pump blood through our body. Your kidneys regulate fluid balance and remove waste from your body. So organs have jobs to do. Well, even within a single cell, it actually has smaller parts within it that have certain jobs to do. We call these things cell organelles. So they're a part within a cell with a specific function. We're going to be learning about what those parts are, what they look like, what they do, and that's how we're going to spend most of this unit, studying those organelles. So again, just snoring out, it's a part within a cell with a special job. So we have here two cells. One of them is an animal cell, one is a plant cell. Can you tell me which is which and give me a reason why you think that? Dean, what do you think?
The one on the left is a plant cell because science says only plants can have cell walls, and the cell looks like a wall.
Yeah, you're correct. So this is a plant cell, this is an animal cell. And they look different from each other. And Dean is correct. This thick sort of outer layer, that's the cell wall, and that's only found in plant cells. The shape is also telling. Plant cells often sort of are angular or rectangular, square sort of shape, where animal cells are often sort of roundish or sort of a blobby sort of shape. So we're going to talk about a whole bunch of these organelles, and we're going to talk about what they do, where they're located. So the first one being the cell wall. So this is the cell wall. It's this thicker, outer, dark green area on this plant cell. And the cell wall is sort of a structure that is not living. It's made of a material called cellulose. It's a carbohydrate. It's a very sort of tough, durable substance. And it's the outermost layer of the plant cell. And it helps sort of give the plant cell its shape and support. But one thing to know about the cell wall, it's a non-living part of the plant cell. So it's not a living part of this plant cell. There will be a question at some point on the test and it will say, what is the outermost living layer of a plant cell? And the answer is not cell wall. Not a lot. Just a shell. When I passed around that cork, that's what you're holding, the leftover cell walls from that plant. Then we have the cell membrane. And the cell membrane, it is the outermost layer in the animal cell. It's the second outermost layer in the plant cell. And the cell membrane is really important. Obviously, it separates the cell from whatever is on the outside. It's very thin, it's flexible. And it is what determines which substances can get into the cell and which substances cannot. Many things have to pass back and forth from outside to inside the cell and vice versa. And it's the cell membrane that can regulate that. Then we have an organelle called the cytoplasm. It's not really an organelle, I shouldn't say that. It's a substance. It's basically the material that fills up the inside of the cell. Did you ever have someone made like that jello mold and with chunks of fruit stuck within it? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Well, like the jello part would be like the cytoplasm, and the little chunks of fruit stuck within it would be like the organelles.
Yeah, they call it strawberries.
Yeah. So that's like all this blue area is the cytoplasm. This light green area, that's the cytoplasm in these cells. Okay?
So, I know that like when you boil an egg, there's like this really thin stuff on top of that, and isn't it like the membrane of the egg?
Yeah, it's a membrane. It's not like a cell membrane, but it's a membrane, yes. That thin, flexible layer that you gotta peel off. Yeah, the cytoplasm in a cell helps hold things in place. Material moves through it as well. So if I look at this photograph taken under a microscope, so this is one cell. This is animal or plant? Animal. Kind of just bendy in shape, flexible, no stiff outer wall. This is the cell membrane. This white area is the cytoplasm. The blue thing is the nucleus, which we'll get to in a second. So a nucleus is a pretty large organelle inside of the cell. It's important. And the nucleus has like parts within it that they talk about. So the outermost layer of the nucleus kind of looks like a little tennis ball or something. The outermost layer is called the nuclear membrane. It's just a thin, flexible membrane surrounding the nucleus. Okay. Within the nucleus is a small organelle called the nucleolus, and then there's also some chromosomes in there. That whole thing is called the nucleus. And the nucleus, we sometimes say it's like the control center of the cell. Kind of like the brain of the cell is what people will say sometimes. Because in it is the DNA which controls how the cell works. So the outer layer, the nuclear membrane, basically separates the nucleus from the rest of the cell and controls things moving in and out of the nucleus. It's kind of the equivalent to the cell membrane. Controls what goes in and out. inside that nucleus are these chromosomes. Now sometimes they look like this, like these X's. Other times they unwind and are sort of like a ball of string. But these chromosomes, what do they contain? Aiden? Your genes. They're made of DNA. They have your genetic information. We all got half of our chromosomes from our mother and half from our father. Chromosomes are what make you who you are. So those chromosomes are stored inside of the nucleus. And then finally, this nucleolus, the word itself means little nucleus. Nucleolus. And so the nucleolus, its job is to make another organelle, which we're about to talk about. It makes ribosomes. I'll try to give you some hints to remember what these organelles do. So one of the next organ we'll talk about is the endoplasmic reticulum. It's a mouthful, but we abbreviate it ER often. And the ER is a series of tubes that usually is right around the nucleus. There's kind of two varieties of ER. There's sometimes the rough ER, which has all these little dots on it, as you see here. Or there's also smooth ER, which doesn't have all those dots on it. And we'll get to the dots in a second. The function of the ER is to transport things, to move proteins and things around in the cell. Things can travel through these tubes. So one way I try to help people remember is ER, what does ER also stand for? Emergency room. So if you got hurt, you would be transported to the ER. ER's job is to transport things within the cell. These little specks on the rough ER, they're the organelle called the ribosome. And the ribosome's job is to make proteins. Cells are mostly made of protein, and so this protein comes from the ribosomes. The way I help you remember is the first three letters of that are what? Yeah. Anyone like to eat ribs? What do they make? What kind of food are they? Or meat. And what nutrient does meat have? So if you remember ribs, go with protein. The ribosome's job is to make those proteins. Some of the ribosomes are on the ER, like we have on the rough ER here. Others are just kind of floating around in the cytoplasm on their own. Next organelle, the Golgi bodies. Golgi bodies package up proteins that are going to be sent out of the cell, and they get them ready to be released. It's kind of like the post office of the cell. That packages up things and sends them out. When I describe them, I usually say they look like a stack of pancakes with delicious drops of syrup. Stack of pancakes with little drops of pure 100% maple syrup. Sounds good, doesn't it? And what happens in the Golgi bodies are they take proteins that came from the ER and the ribosomes, they put them into these little bubbles, and these bubbles then move to the outside of the cell and kind of break open, releasing their contents out of the cell. So this is how cells produce proteins that are going to be released. I never listened to the band Fish. The band Fish, P-H-I-S-H. No? Yeah, never heard of Fish? Anyway, they have a song that references several organelles. But since you don't know the band, I guess I can't tell you. I'll play a song for you. Vacuoles. Vacuoles are for storage. They're these little bubbles within a cell that store material. And usually plant cells have a very large central vacuole that it's filled up with water. Animal cells have much smaller vacuoles. They could store things like water or waste or food. So this thing, it looks like an ice cube in the middle of this plant cell, that's a vacuole. And it's kind of like a beach ball. If you blow it up full with air, that's filled with water, it pushes against the cell wall and gives the cell a very rigid shape. If it gets deflated and you deflate the beach ball, it's kind of soft and squishy. That's what happens when a plant wilts. The central vacuoles lose water and they can't hold their position very well. Lysosomes are small organelles that have digestive enzymes in them to break down material. Oh, this is also a vacuole here. This gray in this electron microscope image, that's all central vacuole. So when an organelle is no longer useful and needs to be sort of destroyed and recycled, the lysosome does that. It uses enzymes to break it down. Lysosomes break down pathogens in white blood cells. Okay, final two organelles, both related to energy. Mitochondria. Mitochondria looks like a jelly bean with a bunch of folds in it. And the mitochondria's job is to supply cells with all the energy they need to go about their business. All cells must have energy, otherwise they don't stay alive. And that happens in this mitochondria. They have special enzymes in there. Sometimes we call them the mighty mitochondria because they're the powerhouse of the cell, releasing energy. Cells that require a lot of energy have a lot of mitochondria. For example, your muscle cells have many mitochondria in them because they use lots of energy contracting. And the process that happens, that we'll learn about in our next section, is called respiration. That's the process of taking food and getting the energy out of it. Our last organelle is the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are found in plant cells only. And what happens in those chloroplasts? What are plants able to do that other organisms cannot? Carter? Yeah, photosynthesis. The chloroplast, oh wait, here's your next Halloween costume idea. You can be a mitochondria. And you'd be a big head. Anyway, chloroplasts are these green structures. They have this pigment called chlorophyll in them. And they're able to capture the sun's energy and use it to make food for the plant cell, to make glucose, a type of sugar. And that's what plants use for energy. Call that photosynthesis. They're green. They just look like under the microscope little circular things that are green inside. You can see them here. And those are our cell organelles. Any questions?